Welcome to the 23rd video in the series, Foundations of Communist Organizing. Today we'll be going over the 1921 piece by the Communist Party of Italy's section of the Third International, The Democratic Principle, which I had subtitled, Revolutionary Requirements Guide Organization Beyond Democracy. Let's talk about what that means, and note we're talking about democratic centralism most pertinently here, but there's also more or less a definition that this turns into in terms of any consultation of the rank and file. Let's just put it that way. And we'll talk more about organic centralism down the line, but this is really the start of the conception of what it would, I believe in this piece, be called organic centralism, if not, then later down the line. Okay. In this text, the democratic organizing principle is questioned, investigated, and ultimately discarded for a variety of reasons. Ultimately, it recognizes democracy as a tactic which can be put into play under certain circumstances, but not as a universal guiding principle that should be applied everywhere. Firstly, the question of organization is the best way a hierarchy can be structured in order to 1. Ensure the defense of collective interests of all components while not supporting partial ones. 2. Avoid the formation of a privileged strata. The democratic method can help reduce this issue, but reinforces it at the same time in other ways. Through the understanding of organization on this basis, we can come to certain other determinations as well, such as that worker organization should only appoint positions internally and not accept external appointments. The party must remain closed. An example of democracy in service of the proletariat can be seen in worker councils, which reject bourgeois democracy. Worker councils arise organically from the struggle against bourgeois oppression of unions, and lack a system of direct election of delegate to its supreme representative body, instead having different levels of councils, each level having a more and more broad territorial base, whereby local or district councils electing delegates to higher councils and its own administration. In these councils, on the lowest level, city or rural, everyone is consulted. Meanwhile, elections to higher councils and administrative offices are based solely on majority, with no parties. The list of candidates put forward as delegates by the various councils. This system forces characteristics of compact, homogeneous bodies capable of directing action and political struggle, creating leadership which serves the goal of the organization. The Communist Party must criticize the undemocratic engagement of yellow unions clearly to the masses, platforming the worker council solution and showing that this is to the masses' immediate interest to adopt. And to be clear, yellow unions are effectively, essentially when a union capitulates to the bosses in such a way that loses its autonomy. Effectively, what happens is that the union bosses go in and enter into contract of some form with the state and / or with the company in exchange for members of the unions having greater economic protections. It's a form of class collaborationism. So one of the things with wage labor is, of course, that the absolute floor of wages is the cost to reproduce labor power, which is getting people back to work the next day and in the long run, reproducing the proletariat as a class. Of the working class as a whole in a nation interrelated with the international free market of labor, not any individual worker. This is determined by a variety of factors, but let's just put it as housing, food, means of consumption in general, domestic labor, which is unpaid, and transportation of workers during the times that they're not laboring, and so on. This, of course, leads to massive issues of interest, right? The subjugation of women or domestic labor to offset all costs of maintaining the worker on unpaid schmucks. Interest in keeping labor in conditions wherein they cannot increase the costs to reproduce their labor power as a whole, which is in conflict with other capitalists who want to increase prices for their means of consumption that they're trying to sell, and so on and so forth. In other words, the maintenance and expansion of patriarchy, and so on and so forth. And those who have special needs above and beyond basic reproduction of the working class as a whole, those with more dependents than average, which is why we have a trend towards 2.5 children and so on and so forth, because of course we also need to think about the reproduction of the proletariat as a class across generations. So you want to have a slight but not too much of an increase in total amount of laborers, and states work very hard to actually maintain a particular amount of children per couple in general. The disabled, those barred from average wages from racism, the gender wage gap, and so on, these are people placed in super exploitative conditions. And then they're further modulated by national conditions of the labor market and intersection with the global labor market, degree of competition in the labor market, especially for individual jobs, and that's where unions come in most directly, because whereas their whole deal, it's about being able to withhold labor power through collective bargaining and class action. And then of course, the degree of class conflict, with workers working through things like minimum wages and additional rights to higher quality means of consumption, and so on and so forth. This of course creates pressure on the working class to do things to reduce the vulgarities of the free market of labor within capitalist society, because the more competition there is between laborers, the lower their bargaining power. This is why unions and other reformist worker organizations find it difficult to take up a coherent and revolutionary stance. Their interests lead them necessarily because they're trying to control the labor market. The only thing that the proletariat can sell, their labor, that's what they're trying to control the market of. And this leads them to be anti-immigrant, racist, sexist, and so on, further emboldened, of course, by capitalists who seek to engage in the super exploitation of these vulnerable groups and get the working class to fight amongst itself, rather than demanding little things like, full employment and end to institutional racism and sexism and the like, and remuneration of domestic labor, among other things, which would handily work in the unions' long-term interests. But their short-term interests their opportunist interests are in order to control the flow of labor, in order to maximize the value of their union membership's labor power. So, any worker organization which does not attack capitalist relations and the bigoted defects born of the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby, calling for a radical and new society and rejection of bourgeois society, is in fact reactionary in nature. This is one of the main problems with unions, because they are reformists, right? And they're focusing on the now. But we also need to operate within these sorts of things while recognizing their fundamental limitations. Ableism, sexism, racism, anti-immigration, and all other forms of prejudice stem from the narrow horizons of bourgeois right, which must be crossed in its entirety for communism to finally achieve its higher phase. It is only in a system of wage labor that a reserve army of labor, or involuntary unemployment, is quote-unquote necessary. And it's only necessary for those taking advantage of laborers, right? So, yeah. Unions have a tendency are reformist organizations, and they have a tendency to drive into class collaboration on those grounds in order to protect the immediate interests of their membership, and especially the union bosses. And we see a variety of laws put in place in order to protect these yellow unions at the expense of red unions, which are proper revolutionary unions that maintain autonomy. Things like the Taft-Hartley Act and so on. It is indisputable that the party bases itself on the entirety of the proletarian class in general, on an international level, and on a historical universal level, across the struggle for the reconstruction of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the development of communism. It acts as a specific organ which has consciousness and action that reflects the needs for victory. Therefore, party structure and organization depends on the tasks it has to carry out, and how those tasks are allocated, developed. The decision-making process in general should be a majority principle, but not necessarily always. At different times and places, the party must assume different forms of organizational structure. For example, during conditions of warfare, the party must hold onto tight discipline and be able to function as a general staff, utilizing the tight militarist structure. Hence, even though the party has a composition that is a result of selection through 1. Spontaneous voluntary membership, and 2. Control of recruitment, That does not necessarily make the decisions of the majority the best. The best is not decided by the number of supporters. It is decided by if it contributes to better functioning of the party's executive bodies. As we can see, communists are for majority rule and call for it in the vast majority of the time. However, we cannot raise democracy to the level of a principle. Centralism most certainly. But because democracy is a flaky term that can be adopted by the bourgeoisie, and because there are aspects of the party which requires not merely a majority, but complete universal agreement and comprehension of, without factions on, such as the need for internationalism, democracy as a phrase as the basis for organizing can be used when useful and discarded when necessary. So it's a moving from democratic centralism as a principle to centralism as a principle and democratic centralism as a tactic to achieve centralism, along with a variety of other things. With that said, that is my summary of the democratic principle from the Communist Party of Italy section of the Third International. If you'd like to go over the quotations I derived this summary from, then please feel free to go down into the description below and you'll find a link to this Google Doc. And in addition, you'll also find a link to United Marxist Pact's Discord server. If you'd like to discuss more about this, then please feel free to join and we'd love to talk to you about it. Tomorrow we will be going over the 1921 piece by Hermann Gorder, Open Letter to Comrade Lenin. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary, and I hope to see you tomorrow.